Hey everybody, welcome to FoundFlix. On this Ending Explained, we'll be looking at one I know you guys have been begging for. Shutter Island, the twisty thriller set on a remote island near Boston that is home to the criminally insane. This movie is absolutely exceptional on all fronts, especially the way the story unfolds. It really makes us feel along for the ride with the Marshal obsessed with finding the truth, which he does even if it's not the truth he's expecting. First and foremost, Shutter Island continues the always legendary team-up of star Leonardo DiCaprio and director Martin Scorsese that began with Gangs of New York. Of course, Leo gives an incredible performance as usual, going to extremes of emotions, and really makes you feel for his character's painful journey. On the technical side, the cinematography by longtime Scorsese and Tarantino collaborator Robert Richardson is perfectly moody, and the dream sequences include some absolutely breathtaking, memorable images. We also can't forget about the set design of the Ashcliff Hospital that really enhances the feel of the movie. And the design was created based on specifications of a doctor who actually worked at a similar facility in the same period as the film. Then of course there's the story itself, which not only includes a memorable, devastating twist, but also has a lot of other layers going on with it to explore as well. And unlike most twist kind of movies, Shutter Island is designed for multiple viewings, as clues are littered throughout you'll most likely miss on the first watch. All that to say the movie is awesome, and definitely worth watching first, as this video will be presented more from the perspective of already having multiple viewings under your belt. So let's begin our analysis of Shutter Island, breaking down everything about the story, the hidden details throughout, as well as explaining the ending. While our main story is that of our protagonist Andrew uncovering the secrets of the institution Ashcliff, he is actually playing a part in a much bigger story than it at first appears, involving the evolution of psychiatric care. At the time the story takes place in 1954, in the field of therapy there was a war of sorts amongst doctors about how to treat the mentally insane, particularly those with violent natures. To many contemporary doctors, these patients were considered no longer human or monsters, and essentially unable to be cured, which led to the rise of lobotomies used on the patients to make them easier to control and docile. This real-life movement was spearheaded by one doctor in particular, a Dr. Freeman, who would actually travel the country visiting mental hospitals and performing lobotomies on the more troublesome patients. In the film, this old-school perspective is represented by Max von Sydow's Dr. Naring, who has no compassion for his patients, believing them to be subhuman. On the other hand, a more modern philosophy of treatment began to emerge in counterbalance to this. This perspective represented by Dr. Colley, played by Ben Kingsley, who believes in treatment without the use of painful surgery or simply drugging the patient into submission, but by treating them with care and compassion to hopefully cure them, or at least help them face their issues at the core of their madness. It's this debate that constructs the story of the film, Colley and Naring using a particular patient of theirs to try out a radical new kind of treatment at Colley's behest, an extremely elaborate role-play therapy which he hopes will allow them to break through to their most dangerous and violent patient, a disturbed man by the name of Andrew Ladis, who suffered a total mental break after the death of his wife and 3 children. Andrew is unable to deal with the reality of what has happened, and the truth that he murdered his wife. In his case, in order to suppress it, his mind created an entirely new personality, Teddy Daniels, along with a fantastic narrative about the tragedy to block out his pain. While the deaths of his family caused this break, Andrew was first haunted by his time serving in the army during World War II. One particular incident during the clearing of a concentration camp called Dachau sticking with him long after. He's horrified seeing piles of dead prisoners in the snow, all taken out by the Nazi forces knowing they were on their way. The commander attempted to kill himself and is found by Andrew bleeding out on the floor from his wounds. Andrew stares coldly as the man dies, considering him a monster for killing all those innocent people, this being a big factor of what Andrew feels later. After this, the troops round up the remaining German soldiers and brutally slay them. But was this justified for what they did, or simply murder? These horrific sights never left Andrew's mind, and upon returning to the States and his wife Dolores and 3 children, he began to drink heavily to put his mind at ease, seeing that he drinks to avoid confronting his problems. This comes back to bite him, as he also avoids telltale signs that Dolores is mentally ill, refusing to believe it and get her treatment. Things first reach a dangerous level when she lights their apartment on fire in a suicide attempt, but again, instead of getting her help, Andrew moves the family out to a lake house, hoping a change of scenery and getting out of the city might be enough for Dolores. This proves to have tragic consequences. When Andrew returns home from working a case as a US Marshal and discovers Dolores completely soaked. Andrew asking, "Why are you so wet, baby?" When looking to the lake, he sees why, spotting the bodies of his 3 children floating in the water. Furiously, he swims to them, but it's too late. All 3 are dead, drowned by Dolores, whose mental illness has taken over completely. And in her distorted mind, she believes that killing her children is actually helping to save them. Andrew is devastated, especially knowing he was avoiding the truth about Dolores' illness. Overwhelmed with guilt and anger, Andrew shoots his wife and kills her, now completely alone, his entire family dead. Understandably, this is the tragedy that breaks Andrew mentally, creating the Teddy persona in a form of dissociative identity disorder. Teddy is similar to Andrew. Both are US Marshals, but Teddy is unburdened by this horrible event in his past, and as a result, it is completely mentally blocked out by Andrew, pushed into the subconscious while the Teddy persona takes over. After the trial regarding the murder of his wife, Andrew was sent to Ashcliffe, a hospital for the criminally insane, where he stayed as a patient for 2 years. And what Andrew has to do in order to get better is come to terms with the memories that he has worked so hard to avoid. Only after accepting the painful truth will Andrew, the original man, be brought back. During his stay at Ashcliffe, along with the Teddy persona came an extremely elaborate fiction related to what happened. In Teddy's mind, his wife was killed by a different man called Andrew Latus, his real name, but to eschew guilt has manifested another person entirely as being responsible for her murder. This person is not real, but part of the fantasy constructed in Andrew/Teddy's mind. In addition to this, as Andrew is suffering from hallucinations, rather than believing the hospital staff are who they actually are, has also created new roles for them as part of his fantasy narrative. This brings us to the events of the film, where Dr. Colley stages an elaborate role play as one final desperate attempt to break through to Andrew, getting everyone in the facility involved, each playing a part to actually feed into Andrew's fantasy. The intent is to lead him through his fantasy and play into it at every step, to prove to him that it's not real, in the end bringing him to face his past to hopefully bring Andrew back. This experiment is what we see unfolding over the course of the film. The roleplay begins with Andrew heading towards the island, again playing a US Marshal, supposedly sent to the island in search of a missing patient called Rachel, the fictional equivalent to his wife in reality, as well as his daughter's name. Even from the very beginning, we see how much Andrew blocks specific things in reality that are connected to his family's death, with 2 main obstacles. Here, it's water. He literally can't handle the sight of water due to how his children were drowned, so he tries to block it completely, which you couldn't really do out at sea. So the water all around the boat is causing him to violently throw up. He's not seasick, it's the water itself. There's also fire, tied to the first suicide attempt by his wife. And throughout the film, up to a point, Andrew never directly interacts with fire, having others light his cigarettes consistently. He can't stand the sight of it either, because that's how much he's blocked it out of his memories. Of course, they can't leave Andrew a violent patient on his own, so he's teamed up with a partner, someone Teddy has never met before, but inherently seems to trust. This is because he is also part of the fantasy. In real life, he is Andrew's doctor, here playing the part of his partner Chuck. This is why they get along right off the bat. Andrew has actually met him while a patient, while Teddy has not. And since Chuck's not really a US Marshal, he fumbles when he's told to hand over his gun to the guards, because he's not familiar with handling it, while Andrew, who at one point was a US Marshal, has no problem at all, showing us early that things aren't what they might seem to be on the surface. Another clue to this is when they arrive, they are surrounded by several heavily armed guards, keeping a close eye on Andrew, because they know he is actually the most dangerous patient in the facility and has caused trouble with them before, hence the heavy artillery. They take Chuck and Andrew to meet Dr. Colley, who, as mentioned, is trying to progress the methods of therapy and is the mastermind behind this entire experiment. And when asked about the missing Rachel, the journey for Teddy begins. A strange mashing of reality and fiction, telling them that Rachel mysteriously escaped, mentioning she killed her 3 children, telling him that Rachel, a patient for 2 years, doesn't believe she's in an institution, with the staff playing roles in her fantasy, which is actually referring to Andrew. In reality, Rachel doesn't exist at all, but is also a part of Andrew's own fantasy. He goes to investigate her room, finding his first clue left by Colley, a note from Rachel with 2 seemingly random phrases written. The Law of 4. Who is 67? This cryptic message is part of the mystery set up by Colley, which we learn the meaning of much later. To To Andy's Teddy persona, the Ashcliff facility is what he's actually here to investigate, believing them to be doing radical experiments on the patients, intending to find proof of their wrongdoings and blowing the lid off the whole operation. And piece by piece, this is what appears to Teddy to be going on there. Again, because the entire scenario is staged for this exact purpose. This does begin to work to open his psyche to his past, having a vision that night of Dolores, telling him she's still here. Rachel? Andrew asks, Dolores responding she never left. Because Rachel and Dolores are actually the same, she did indeed never leave Andrew's memories. She begs with him to let her go, but he can't, as this is the entire struggle for him personally. She turns to ash in his arms as the apartment ignites into flames and water pours after she is gone, referencing both the fire and water that he fears, which is especially problematic when a huge storm hits the island. And Andrew then interrogates the other patients in Rachel's last session, who of course all know who Teddy really is, and act a bit weird when he keeps asking if they know Andrew Laeddis. They're like, "That's you, dude?" Once again, here we see the blocking of reality Andrew is capable of. When questioning another patient, she asks Chuck for a glass of water, which actually at one point disappears from her hand. This is showing us from Andrew's perspective just how much he can't stand the sight of water, and so in his reality makes the glass literally disappear. Later, Chuck asks him about the name Andrew Laeddis, and Teddy opens up about who he is within his fantasy, describing Laeddis as a maintenance man who worked in their building that set the fire that killed his wife. In the fiction, Teddy also having no children. He says Andrew got away with the murder, later going on to burn down a schoolhouse, resulting in him winding up being a patient at Ashcliff where he was never heard from again. He doesn't mean to kill Laeddis though, declaring he's had enough of that, describing to Chuck about his time in World War II killing all the guards, deciding that it wasn't warfare, it was murder. But finding the killer isn't his real goal as we know, but rather to expose what he believes are the secret mind experiments being performed on the island. Showing us the treatment is actually to support this fantasy, Chuck feeds into his theories, suggesting that perhaps they actually wanted him here and faked the escape, and feeling the place reeks of black ops, even though he's well aware this isn't the truth. The next events only establish further something odd going on when Rachel is randomly found, but Andrew isn't so sure of what he's being told, noticing she doesn't have a scratch on her, which would prove impossible with the island's rough terrain. This Rachel is yet another day player in Teddy's story, a nurse portraying the missing patient, who does pretend to be crazy really well. As before, her story is a blending of fact and fiction, not recalling drowning her children, and then confusing Andrew for her dead husband Jim, asking how she is supposed to survive without him, again related in reality to how Andrew needs to let go of Dolores. These encounters seem to be a somewhat vague way for Andrew to mentally tap into that barricaded area of his mind, by making him think about his past without directly confronting him with it. This, along with not being on his medication, is having a profound effect, as the lightning outside increases in intensity, a side effect of not being on his meds, causing the reality and fiction to blend together even more in Andrew's mind as he begins to confront his past, finding himself back in the concentration camp where his true pain began. But this time the fallen mother and child turn into Rachel 1 and his daughter, who rises up whispering, "You should have saved me." He then appears in Collie's estate and comes face to face with his fictional version of Andrew, who lights him a cigarette, offering he hopes there's no hard feelings. Hearing a scream, Rachel is there covered in blood, asking him for a hand, revealing 3 dead children's bodies in front of her. He picks up his daughter, the same scene at the camp, again asking why he didn't save her. Andrew painfully saying he wanted to, but by the time he got there it was too late. Shifting to the lake house, Andrew's seen walking backwards holding his daughter's body, and drops her into the water, remarking they look beautiful. Andrew bolts away, still hallucinating, as Dolores then appears, him asking why she's all wet, the same thing he asked when he first saw her. He is beginning the first stages of confronting what happened, but hasn't quite gotten everything opened up entirely just yet. Outside, the storm has worsened, knocking out the facility's electrified fences, and all the patients have gotten loose. In the chaos, Andrew decides it's a perfect time to check out the off-limits Ward C, where they keep only their most dangerous patients, assuming that the killer he's seeking must be there. What we end up up learning is just how violent Andrew actually is for the first time, as a patient tags him running off, and Andrew chases him down, aggressively punching and choking the man, only getting stopped by Chuck, who pulls him off. Geez, buddy, got some issues there, huh? He delves further into the facility, coming to a series of cells, lighting matches repeatedly to see where he's going. This is the first time Andrew is seen lighting a match of his own. Up to this point, consistently someone else is always lighting it for him, now indicating to us that he is beginning also to confront and control his fear of fire instead of completely blocking it out. Then another example of his violent nature is seen when he comes across a man, George Noyce, who plays different roles in Teddy's fictional story and in real life. To Teddy, he was a key part of turning him into the shady goings-on at Ashcliff, but in reality is another patient who Andrew knows well, and he is actually the one who beat the crap out of Noyce. In their conversation, Noyce is truthful and straightforward to Andrew, but he doesn't understand what the man is talking about since it doesn't fit in with his fantasy version of the man's story. His denial is reinforced when he reunites with Chuck, who after meeting with Noyce, Andrew doesn't trust as much. Chuck reveals he found Andrew Laetus's intake form, something that would prove invaluable in Teddy's case, but since reading it would actually break through his fantasy, Andrew dismisses it. If anything, he's becoming even more wrapped up in the supposed conspiracy and fantasy, and decides to head out to the Mysterious Lighthouse on his own, believing this to be the location of the facility's secret experiments, but can't get to the lighthouse, as the tide is too high. No way he's going to swim through that water. When he climbs back up, Chuck is gone, and it appears to him down below that he has fallen to his death, his body lying motionless on the rocks. But when he gets to the spot, the body isn't there, because it was never there in the first place, especially as he is seen alive and well later. This is indicating that Andrew's hallucinations are becoming more powerful, which explains what happens next, as he spots a fire in a cave by the rocks, inside finding a woman who also calls herself Rachel, but rather than being a patient, was a doctor at the hospital that was forced into hiding after discovering their nefarious hidden agenda. She details their plans to use lobotomies to create a man to not feel pain or love, and their intent is to create an entire army of these ghosts under their control to go out into the world to do things a sane man never would, and that everyone in the facility is in on it. He inquires about the lighthouse, and she confirms what he's been suspecting, that it is where these surgeries happen and where these so-called ghosts are created, which is completely untrue, and this Rachel is only a figment of Andrew's imagination. His desire to believe the constructed conspiracy theory about Ashcliff has created her to further confirm everything he wants to believe is going on here, and after Chuck's disappearance, believes that he has been taken to the lighthouse himself. When asking Collie about Chuck's whereabouts, his behavior matches this, telling Andrew that he came alone, and there was no partner, and Andrew thinks he's on to Collie, changing his story when asked again about Chuck, responding, "What partner?" believing his abduction is simply being covered up, and not wanting the doctor to think he's onto him. He is entirely convinced that he has to save Chuck from the lighthouse, and decides to create a distraction, but first is interrupted by another vision of Dolores, telling him he has to get off this island, removing his tie, jamming it into the car's gas tank, and lighting it, causing a huge explosion that temporarily envelops Dolores and his daughter, though they continue to remain after the fire retreats. In his actions here, we see that Andrew has gotten over one of his phobias, fire. Since he is so driven by the truth, he is willing to blow up the car, no matter what it takes, and soon overcomes his other major fear, water, choosing to swim across the sea to the lighthouse, something only recently he was unable to do. Thinking he's finally gotten to the truth, he will find out he's more right than he could realize, but it's not the truth he's been searching for. Inside the lighthouse, instead of finding evidence of brain surgery, there is only Dr. Collie waiting for him behind a desk, asking, "Why are you all wet, baby?" to his confusion. The same question Andrew asked to Rachel 1 in his earlier dream, knowing this question due to hearing Andrew talk about the same dreams he's been having for years. From here, Teddy's perceived reality begins to crumble, Collie asking him about his hallucinations and tremors, both of which he says are withdrawal symptoms as he hasn't been on his standard medication, revealing to him that he has been a patient here for 2 years, showing him that same intake form that he dismissed earlier, describing Andrew as highly intelligent, highly delusional, and shows no remorse, because to him the crime never took place, creating a fantasy because he can't deal with what happened, clearly describing Andrew himself. And if the Teddy persona had seen this information earlier, it would have disturbed the fantasy reality he had created. Kali laments he wishes he could just let Andrew live in his fantasy world, but he has those violent tendencies. And this is his last chance for a cure. If he doesn't have a breakthrough now from insanity, his new age style of treatment will prove a failure. And as a result, there will be no other choice but to lobotomize Andrew to keep him under control. He reveals everything about the elaborate roleplay experiment they've been undergoing, letting him have the run of the place, only to prove to Andrew how impossible his mentally created conspiracy is, asking if he has any actual proof at this point of any wrongdoing transpiring. Kali then explains the meaning behind the note found in Rachel's room about the rule of 4, which is related to the fictional and real-life versions of people from Andrew's memory, his new persona being an anagram or mixing up of the letters of his real name Andrew Latus, as well as Rachel Solando being an anagram of his wife's name, and that the 67th patient is in fact himself, showing the jumbling of fact and fiction that has been so pervasive in Andrew's mind. Asking about Chuck, he emerges but is not a US Marshal, but in fact Andrew's primary physician during his stay over the last 2 years. Andrew is torn apart and distraught, refusing to believe this could be true, firing at Kali, which creates an exit wound in his fantasy, but in reality, the gun is just a toy, crumbling to pieces in his hand. Going for the harder truth, Kali confronts him with what Dolores did, flashing pictures of his dead children to get him to remember. And it's in particular the picture of his daughter Rachel, another reason he picks this name for his story, that seems to affect Andrew deeply, as Kali asks if he could deny she ever lived. He emotionally grabs the pictures, and a flooding in of the full-on memory of that tragic day occurs, in one of the most brutal scenes ever. Andrew finally remembering the truth in detail about what happened, everything he's been working so hard to keep out for 2 years. Overwhelmed, he is overtaken by blinding light once again, waking up later in a bed overseen by Rachel 1, here in her true identity as a nurse at the hospital, and Dr. Kali, who questions him about his mental state. And it does appear that Andrew is entirely lucid for the first time, and the experiment was able to bring him back to reality. Andrew admitting that he's here because he killed his wife, and that Teddy Daniels doesn't exist, and the most painful truth, that he killed her out of his own guilt for not getting her help before it was too late. Even though this is obviously a substantial breakthrough, Kali still has his reservations, mentioning they had broken through once before 9 months ago, only for Andrew to regress to his fantasy once again. But he is steadfast, clearly grasping the truth this time, that his name is Andrew Latus and he killed his wife in 1952. The next day, they are still unsure if the switch stuck, continuing the roleplay of the experiment, having Chuck, really Dr. Sheeran, join Andrew on the steps, asking what's their next move. And Andrew goes right back into his conspiracy talk, saying they gotta get off this rock, and whatever is going on here is bad, appearing to have relapsed as they worried. Dr. Sheeran giving a solemn headshake to the other doctors nearby that the experiment was a failure. Immediately, orderlies march towards Andrew, who takes a moment to consider a question that provides the answer to if he is really cured or not.
Which would be worse? To live as a monster? Or to die as a good man?
And he is tragically led off to be lobotomized. But he isn't reverting back to his delusions as it might appear. The experiment did work, and now Andrew again understands and remembers the truth about murdering his wife. But the unfortunate side effect is that he has to continue living with the guilt of killing her, or as he said, to live as a monster, which now that he knows the truth again is tearing him apart inside as it did before, tying all the way back to his experience at the concentration camp, where he considered the commander a monster for killing innocent people, but still didn't feel right about killing the other soldiers even if they were guilty for being involved as well. Certainly a complex moral situation, but to Andrew, any killing, even if it appears justified to some capacity, is still wrong. But if he chooses to be lobotomized, he is effectively choosing a form of suicide. After the procedure, he won't have any idea of his past at all, and will continue to live in his fantasy, or die as a good man. This to me is the biggest lingering question of the movie. Does Andrew choose his fate, or has he really regressed back to his fictional reality? Martin Scorsese and Leo both refuse to weigh in on their thoughts on what the live as a monster or die as a man final line means. But the way the story plays out makes it obvious he chooses his fate, and can't bear to live with the guilt and trauma he has suffered that has all come flooding back to him. It also has the unfortunate outcome of seeming to prove that Collie's newer therapy methods fail, and proves that Mailer's barbaric old school methods are still the most viable option. Yeah, the ending is pretty much just a huge bummer no matter which way you look at it. Even with this heartbreaking outcome, I absolutely love the movie, especially the way that the story unfolds and the millions of little details in there that add more layers to help us fully understand everything that's going on. And yes, it is quite confusing, leaving the viewer with many questions, especially after the first viewing. Scorsese was proud of this aspect, saying leaving people with questions would mean they would have to see the movie twice to get all the answers, and thusly the movie would make more at the box office. It did succeed in this aspect, making back 4 times its budget, and up to that point was the most financially successful film of Scorsese's career, until it was surpassed by another team up with Leo, Wolf of Wall Street, which grossed over $300 million worldwide, and to date remains his most financially successful film. This brings us to the conclusion of the analysis and ending explained for Shutter Island. I hope I did you guys proud and answered all your questions about the movie. But if you still got more lingering things you're not so sure about, make sure to post them down below. Don't forget, you can also send me video requests of any kind on my social media accounts at FoundFlix. What did you guys think of Shutter Island and its ending? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Make sure to like, subscribe, and follow. Thanks for watching FoundFlix. See you next time.